We can count offenders, incidents or victims. But as I said, there are problems with recorded crime statistics because it only includes those reports or the incidents that actually get reported to police. So there'll be influences by changes in those rates of reporting. They can also be influenced by changes in policing activity and policing practices. And also we can have different definitions of domestic and family violence across jurisdictions and states, so it makes it difficult to compare. Victim surveys, there's 2 large representative victim surveys that the ABS conduct. So this includes incidents that are reported and those that don't go reported to the police. Because these are national surveys, we can compare New South Wales to Australia overall. We can also ask people whether they reported or not to the police. So we can look at those changing rates of reporting. It can count each victim uniquely. And the Crime Victimisation Australia survey is conducted annually, so we've got annual data to compare with. The disadvantage is the cost of these surveys. It's just very expensive to run a large-scale victim survey, and so we only have data on these surveys from 2008-9 to the most recent being 2015-16. They do ask specifically about the relationship between the victim and the offender, so we can look at domestic and family violent incidents, but once we break that down to looking at one region in New South Wales and a type of offence between types of victims and offenders, the sample size gets so small that it's hard to know if it's really truly representative, and the estimates can become very unreliable. So what we did to overcome that problem is we actually pulled 2 years worth of survey data into one data point. So that's why we've got 4 data points, but 8 years worth of data covered over here. And this is what we found. So looking at this chart, we see bars in blue, which are New South Wales estimates, and bars in grey, which are Australia overall. And then at the top of each bar, there is a thin line, and that's a 95% confidence interval. So these are estimates based on the survey sample, and there's going to be a range of error within that. And what we're looking for is different periods of time when there's no overlap between those error bars, or those confidence intervals. And so just taking New South Wales, we'll look at the first time period, which was 2008 to 10, and you can see that there is an increase to the next time period, but it falls within the confidence interval, so it wasn't a statistically significant increase. But when we look at the next period, from 2010-12 to 2012-14, there's a large fall, and this time actually it was statistically significant. And then the next time period, we see that lower rate was maintained. So it didn't fall much further, but it was maintained in 2014-16. So we did have evidence from the victim survey of a fall in domestic and family violence assaults. And when we look at Australia overall to see if that pattern was happening everywhere, or at least as Australia overall, we see a similar pattern, but it wasn't to the same degree, and none of those changes over time were statistically significant. So that fall really was only significant in New South Wales compared to Australia overall. And when we look at each time period to look at how New South Wales compared to Australia overall at each point in time, we can see at the beginning of the survey period of 2008-2010, there were very similar estimates, and that gap widened over time. So by the time we get to 2014-16, the gap between New South Wales and Australia overall was actually significant. So New South Wales had a significantly lower victimisation rate than Australia overall. So that is encouraging. And we also looked at the reporting rates in the victim survey to see if there had been any changes over time. And if you look at this, you can see from the New South Wales, the blue bars again, that there is some fluctuation from around 60% of incidents of domestic and family assaults being reported to police, down to about 50. And that main change was happening between 2012-14 to 2014 and 16. But if you look at those long skinny bars at the top of the long skinny lines at the top of the bars, you can see there's a really wide margin of error. And so we can't say that that was a significant change. Again, when we compare it to Australia overall, New South Wales was no different, statistically speaking, to the rates for Australia. So that's another encouraging finding, that the reports decreasing the reported crime rates don't seem to be a reflection of changes in reporting rates, but maybe actually a change in actual incidents. But to confirm that even further, we looked at a particular type of assault, which is assaults occasioning grievous bodily harm. So these are the domestic assaults that are very serious in nature. They normally require hospitalisation, and because of the serious nature, they normally do get reported to the police. So they're less susceptible to changes in reporting rates over time. And again, when we tested this data, we found a reduction in incidents. So from this, it's some encouraging news that there does look like there's been an evidence of a fall in domestic and family violence assaults in New South Wales from the recorded crime data and from the victim survey data. There's no evidence that the falls in recorded crime are due to falls in the rate of reporting for these incidents. And while this is encouraging and it provides a good baseline for future monitoring, it doesn't explain why these changes occurred. So as Don said, I'm going to move on to the next analysis that we did, and if you've got any questions, if you can hold them to the end, that would be great. So the second topic I'm going to touch on today is on juvenile perpetrators of domestic and family violence. Normally when we speak of young people in the context of domestic violence, it's normally as victims or witnesses of the violence and the harms associated with that. And when we look at services in New South Wales and our policy response, it's normally been in response to intimate partner violence. So there was a gap in our knowledge when it comes to looking at juvenile perpetrators of domestic violence. And if we can look at these juveniles as a specific segment of that perpetrator population, it helps to inform appropriate prevention strategies and interventions for these young people and for their victims. So why look at juvenile offenders? They account for about 8% of domestic and family violence assault offenders overall, so about 1,500 a year in New South Wales are proceeded against by police, and they account for about 14% of reoffenders. But we actually know that domestic and family violence assaults account for 45% of reported assaults by juveniles in New South Wales. And as we just saw, looking at the overall trends for domestic and family violence assaults, we see that there was a decreasing trend overall and for adults specifically, but when we look at juvenile offenders, it's actually been increasing. So what do we know about these offenders? Well, we took a group of young people aged 10 to 17, a cohort of these young offenders who were proceeded against by police in 2014 and looked at their demographics and other details of their offending. So looking at this chart, you can see that predominantly these young offenders are male, but it is interesting to note that over a third were female. And this is important because that's a much higher proportion than we see amongst the adult population of domestic assault offenders. And we can also see that over half of these young offenders were aged between 16 and 17. So while these are juvenile offenders and they are going to be treated differently within the criminal justice system, they've still got a lot of developing to do in many ways. Physically, they can be at their adult size, and that has implications, especially in terms of domestic incidents. So looking at the offending of these young people, this is looking at both their previous domestic assaults and any of their offending. Domestic assaults being the blue bar. We can see that 17% of this cohort had a prior domestic and family violence assault in the 2 years before 2014. But when we look at any type of offence that they came into contact or were proceeded against by police for, over half of them had some kind of prior offence. So these young people aren't just having one offence type, the domestic assaults. These young people are having a variety of offending in their past. We also found that 30% of this cohort had an apprehended domestic violence order against them in the past 12 months prior to this incident. So it looks like there is a level of underreporting because only 17% had been proceeded against for a domestic assault, but far more actually had an AVO against them. When we look at their reoffending, we see a similar pattern again. where we have a much higher proportion of these young people reoffending within 12 months for a domestic assault than we do for adult DV offenders. And when we look at reoffending of any kind, over half had reoffended within 12 months, which again is a lot higher than for adult offenders, which was 33%. Now, of those young people who reoffended with a DV assault within 12 months, we saw that these people were offending very quickly. So over half of them reoffended within 90 days. And one of the main differences between young people and adult offenders is how they engage with the criminal justice system. And what we found that 36% of these young people who were proceeded against by police for a DV assault were diverted from court, with almost a third of them being cautioned by police, and a small proportion receiving a warning or youth justice conferencing. So about 2/3 proceeded to court, and of those who did go to court, the vast majority of them had a proven offence. But what is interesting to note is that about 8% of those who went to court had their matter dismissed under the Mental Health Act. And I'll just touch on this again in a few moments in another slide. So what do we know about the victims? So this chart looks at the age and gender of victims of domestic assault by juveniles. And again, we see a big difference between male and female victims, with this time the females being by far the majority of the victims. But again, it's interesting to note that males made up a third of the victims. Looking at the age breakdown, we can see them by far the majority of the victims were aged between 36 and 60, with the second most common age category being 13 to 19 years. And this makes a lot of sense when you look at the relationship of the victim to the offender. So for this offence type and this particular cohort of offenders, we look at, it's really a lot of offending by young people towards their parents. So parents made up 43% of the victims, followed by siblings, and then 15% were partners. And in this chart here, we can see that males are represented by the yellow bar and females by the blue bar. And there is some difference in that relationship between victim and offender, particularly when it looks at intimate partner violence, which you can see that the vast majority of those victims were female. And again, yes, there's very sort of a small proportion of the male victims who were intimate partners of the offender. What do we know about the nature of these incidents? Well, I actually looked at 200 police narratives to look at the rich context that's described in those narratives about the incidents that led up to the actual assault and how it was dealt with by police. And this information is available in a bureau brief, but we just didn't have time for that today. So I've just picked out 2 points of interest. So one is, again, the mental health condition of the young person. So almost 1 in 4 of these narratives referred to the offender's mental health. It was either a specified mental health condition that had been diagnosed, so a mood disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or the young person was on the autism spectrum and that was actually brought up in the narrative, or some unspecified mental health condition that the young person was seeing a mental health practitioner about. And 4% of the narratives made reference to the police having to remove the young person for a mental health assessment under the Mental Health Act. Also looking at the seriousness of these incidents, we know that recorded crime for a domestic assault can include threats of assault as well as physical assaults and very, very serious physical assaults. So we weren't sure what was happening here and if they actually, how serious they were. But what we found was over 90% of these young people had engaged in some type of physical assault in that incident, with over half of the victims experiencing some form of minor injury. And only very few had a major injury. So, in summary, we've seen that the rate of juvenile domestic and family violence has been increasing over the past 10 years. That juvenile domestic and family violence is a gendered offence type, although not as accentuated as those for adult offenders. These incidents are most commonly child-to-parent assaults, the criminal behaviour of these young people isn't limited to domestic violence. Those who reoffend do so rapidly, and reported incidents are generally physical assaults, with half of them resulting in minor injury. And we can say that police are being called to respond to these complex situations that may also at times require a health response. So I'll hand over to Don.
Okay. So just while we're getting ready, I should say that I'm going to be talking about the response of the justice system to the problem of domestic violence. Yeah, that's the one. And my news is not as good as Karen's. And I want to say right from the start that that should not be taken in any way, shape or form as a reflection on the program managers who tried to develop ways of reducing re-victimisation and reoffending by domestic violence offenders. You may or may not know that the government set a target of reducing domestic violence reoffending by about 25%. You may or may not know that that is a colossal target, given that if you look at the evaluations that have been done or peer reviewed, there are almost none which show substantial or any reduction in domestic assault. So you shouldn't take this as the end of a journey. It's really the start of a journey to find out how to reduce re-victimisation and how to reduce reoffending. So the roadmap is I'm going to talk to you about a corrections program first called DV Equips and talk about the effect that had on reoffending. Then the Safer Pathway program, most of you would be familiar with. There are two parts to that evaluation I'll go through. The third is a DV-SAT risk assessment tool. That's the Domestic Violence Safety Action Tool. That's a critical part of the program, Safer Pathway program. That's the basis on which people are identified as being at serious threat and therefore referred for action on the part of coordinated response on the part of agencies. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some new research we've done on intimate partner re-victimisation, which flows straight out of the risk assessment tool. Then a little bit we've done on general offending by domestic violence offenders, just to see to what extent they really do specialise or don't specialise in domestic violence. And finally, I'm going to talk about a corrections program called the Violence Offender Treatment Program, because I think it tells us something about the direction in which we might head in future for domestic violence. Okay, the Equips program was, of course, developed to reduce DV reoffending. Its target group are moderate to high risk IPV, intimate partner violence offenders in the custody or on a community-based order. And the treatment, or the essential part of the treatment, is 22-hour sessions of mixed duluth CBT treatment, CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy treatment. So do bear in mind that it's both custody and non-custody people. Evaluation design, I should, for those of you who are statisticians and love to see numbers and equations, you're going to be disappointed here. I'm going to tread quite lightly over the methodology. There are a few gestures in your direction, but I think you're probably mostly interested in the results. So the treatment group were 487 offenders who started DV Equips within 12 months of referral. The comparison group was 700 odd people who had been referred but did not start. And the outcome was either reoffending within 12 months free time. Free time is just time spent out of custody. Or DV-specific reoffending within 12 months free time. All clear? Good. So these are the controls. I'm not going to read each one out. You can read it out for yourself. We had an extensive set of controls, which are mainly based on the Bureau's past experience of the sorts of things that influence risk of reoffending. But having said that, the logistic regression, well, the two methods we used, logistic regression and two-stage least squares, also did bivariate probit. For those of you, if that means nothing to you, don't worry about it. The only thing you need to know is that those two techniques are ways of dealing with factors that you haven't included or haven't explicitly controlled for. So the logistic regression controls for all that stuff, but the other two techniques, two-stage least squares and bivariate probit, attempt to control for things you didn't include in it. To use that second method, you need to construct an instrument. That's a factor that influences access to treatment but doesn't have any effect on reoffending except through treatment. If you think that's more than you needed to know, you can just relax. We'll get to the results soon enough. Does anybody actually care? Is there any statistician in the audience? Oh, we got one or two. Oh, good. Okay, that's for you. Right, so these were the results. Now, the negative sign for the starting DV Equips, this is for general reoffending, it's a sign that there's a reduction in offending. So that's good news. Doesn't matter which technique you use. As it turned out, We didn't have an omitted variable bias problem, so the logistic regression's good enough to look at. But tragically or sadly, none of the effects were statistically significant. The standard errors are pretty big. So things were heading in the right direction, but there was no significant effect. And for DV offending, things weren't even heading in the right direction. There was no indication at all that you were getting a reduction in reoffending, despite the fact that the sample sizes are all quite sizable. So the take-home message at that stage of proceedings was that we had no evidence that DV equips reduces DV. The findings that we saw there were consistent with other studies, especially those that looked at the Duluth type programs. If you're interested in that, the Miller, Drake and Nafziger review is quite conclusive on that. But there is a Campbell collaboration and systematic review. And this is what I was mentioning earlier when I said there are very few studies which have found any significant effects for DV offending programs. But there are important caveats. First of all, only half of those who are referred to treatment completed treatment. Okay, none of the control group got any treatment, but only half of those in the treatment sample completed it. So you've got what might be called a treatment dilution effect. In other words, the effect of those who completed treatment might be hidden to some extent by those who didn't finish it. The second thing to bear in mind is that the control group got something. They were under supervision, and we know from past research in the Bureau that supervision does exert an effect, a downward effect on risk of reoffending. So you're really looking for DV equips to add something extra to the effect that you would have got anyway with the supervision. Okay, the Safer Pathway program. Am I travelling too fast for anybody? Just say no. No, Don? Thank you. So the aim here was to reduce the risk of DV re-victimisation. This is really a flagship program in some ways from the state government. The target group were all women reporting domestic violence who are assessed as being at serious risk of repeat victimisation. And the treatment, if you could call it that, or the process, was that high-risk cases, that is to say, people judged to be at serious risk of a repeat victimisation, were referred to a multi-agency team called a Safer Action meeting, not in the presence of the victim, and they would develop an individual case plan which was tailored, or if you like, a safety action plan, which was tailored to the individual victim to try and reduce the risk of further victimisation. So that might mean something as simple as changing the locks on the house, or taking him to other accommodation, or seeing what else could be done to apprehend the offender. It was a specially designed response to that person's risk of victimisation. So the evaluation group in the first study consisted of 9 local area commands where the full program had been introduced, and the comparison group consisted of 9 local area commands that had been carefully matched, where the safety action meetings and safety action plans didn't exist, but importantly where conventional support was still provided. That's the Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service. So it's not as if nothing was happening in the control group, they were getting what you might call business as usual. So the outcome was any change in the victim-reported incidents of stalking, physical assault, threatened assault, intimidation, or verbal abuse. So these were interviews by one of our staff of the victims, both shortly after the report of the incident and some 6 weeks or about 6 weeks later, we would follow up and run them through the same questionnaire to see what changes had occurred. So what we were expecting to find was a bigger reduction in the treatment group in those outcomes. So the analysis, this is only a concession to the statisticians. I won't say any more about it. They know why I'm doing that. The key thing you need to note here is the incident rate ratio, and all you need to know about that is if the incident rate ratio is less than 1, then that's good news. That means the violence is going down. If it's 1 or near to 1, that means there's no effect. If it goes above 1, that means there's more offending after treatment. So that's all you need to know about the results to understand what the next slide tells you. So let's just have a look at the intervention lacks first. If you look down the incident rate ratios for all those offences, stalking, physical assault, threats and so on, the great news is that every one of them is less than 1. And the second important part is every one of them is statistically significant. So in the intervention lacks, you're getting a reduction in stalking, a reduction in physical assault, a reduction in threats and intimidation, and a reduction in the 3 forms of verbal abuse, which is great news. Unfortunately, if you look at the comparison lacks, you're getting the same effect. The incident rate ratios for the comparison lacks are all way below 1. They're all statistically significant. So the question then becomes, was there any difference between the treatment and control? And the answer in the final column is no. So both groups got substantial reductions in the unwanted behaviour, but they were the same in both groups. So the second study, we thought, okay, we've had a look, tried to speak to individual victims, let's have a look at what the official figures show in terms of police recording. So this is a fixed effect panel analysis, and we were comparing trends in police outcomes in paired and treatment and comparison groups. So we're finding each LAC and pairing it with another similar LAC, and we were looking at a bunch of outcomes. The two things we were looking for was a difference in the treatment control in either the trend or level after treatment. So just to give you a picture of what I mean, this is Don's little drawing, a control group, no change before and after treatment, and that's what you'd call an accelerated decline. If you look for a drop in level, that's the control group, that's what a drop in level looks like. So you're looking across these measures I'm about to show you for either a drop in the slope or a drop in the level. So what are the outcome measures we looked at? Incidents of DV offences, incidents of DV-specific assault offences, persons proceeded against, persons arrested for DV, persons arrested for domestic violence assault, victims of DV offences, victims of DV assault, and finally police call-outs. So you've got 7 different outcomes you can look at, which is a surefire way of creating confusion amongst the researchers. So here's the first result for DV offences. There's only 2 things you need to know about this. First of all, you want the point estimates, the vertical dots. I'd love to be able to point it out, but it's too high for me. To be the left of 1, that would signify a reduction in offending. And the confidence intervals, which Karen nicely explained, are the 95% confidence intervals. So you don't want those error bars, those wings, to be overlapping with 1. If that happens, nothing is happening. So you can see looking down there, there's only 2 things that have significantly changed. LAC pair number 4, I can't remember the name of it. I know you're going to ask me, but I can't remember. Somebody will remember. LAC 4 is significantly down. LAC 9 is significantly up in relation to DV offences. This is the situation for DV assault. Doesn't look like there's anything happening here. The confidence intervals either touch or overlap with 1. This is the situation for persons charged with DV offences. As you can see, there's a significant downward trend for LAC pair number 8. Is this okay? Am I going too quickly? All good? Okay. Otherwise, no significant change. That's the situation for DV assault offences. And again, there's nothing happening there. Oh, the blue and the red, don't worry about that. You had first 5 LACs come online and then 4 later. That just distinguishes the 2 groups. And finally, we have the victims. LAC 4 is showing signs there. LAC 9 is again misbehaving. And if you look at the victims of DV assault, you can see there's not too much happening there. And finally, the call-outs. LAC 9 went the wrong way again, and there's not much to show there. So looking at the overall effects for drop in level or faster decline for each of them, the news is not much good. You can read it yourself, but you can see that only 1 or 2 cases in every one of the outcomes went the right way or went the way we'd all want. In the other cases, there was either no effect. So what do we take from that? Well, it's clear enough, at least on the evidence we've got so far, that rates of self-reported DV are lower in both treatment and control groups post-treatment, but there's no difference between them. There's little evidence of a change in the officially recorded DV offences following treatment, but of course there are current caveats. The first one is that current practice in relation to DV may already be best practice. In other words, the Domestic Violence Advocacy Service may be doing work that can't be improved on even by the Safer Pathway program. The second big puzzle here is that we don't actually know what the difference was in the treatment or support provided in the DV-CAS groups with the Safer Pathway group. So we don't really know whether they were getting the same support or quite different support. We don't know how many victims actually needed or wanted the support that was available. They may have left the relationship, they may have sorted it out with the support from family and friends. It's not clear, at least in terms of research. But the last one was the one that worried us most. The threshold for getting into the getting into the Safer Pathway program was this risk assessment tool called the DV-SAT. And we thought the next thing we should do is have a closer look at just how reliable that is as a prediction instrument. So this brings us to the next study, which is the DV-SAT evaluation, and we wanted to identify people who are at serious risk of IPV. The target group were all those reporting domestic violence to police, The treatment consists of a 25-question survey of each victim, with those scoring yes on 12 or more items being judged as a serious risk and being referred to a safety action meeting for a safety action plan. So that's the way it worked. Our evaluation design was to measure the predictive accuracy, and in order to do that, we got 24,462 victims who'd completed the DVSAT, and we linked them to records of repeat victimisation to find out how many of those were re-victimised, and of those, what proportion of them had ticked the 12 or more, or ticked any number you like. We're trying to find out how well the instrument was as a predictor, or is. So we examined the predictive accuracy for every single item on the DVSAT. We also looked at it for people who answered yes to more than 12 questions, and we looked at it for the total number of yes answers to questions. I'm not going to take you through all of that, it would take too long. I'm just going to give you an illustration of what we found. Now, just because I know people will want to know what was in the DVSAT, this is not a full list of the questions that were asked. I'll just give you a minute or two. There's no point reading it all out, but you can see the sorts of things that are asked. And those are the individual questions. There's a few missing because I couldn't fit them on one slide. But those are the sorts of questions we were interested in finding out. How good are they as predictors of serious threat? So the measures of accuracy, the positive predictive value, which is the percentage of people you say are at serious risk who turn out to be re-victimised. The negative predictive value is the percentage of people you say are not at serious risk who are not re-victimised. The sensitivity is the percentage of people who are re-victimised who you judge to be at serious risk. And anybody here from psychology? You know what a false alarm is? All right, so 1 minus the specificity is the false alarm. The other thing you need to know is we have this special measure called the area under the curve, AUC. If you get a 1, that's perfect prediction. No one ever gets a 1. If it's 0.5, you're basically doing no better than chance. So these are the results for female victims in relation to physical violence. And along the bottom axis, you've got the number of questions they said yes to. And straight from the start, you would expect your ability to pick victims would increase with the number of questions you said yes to. And if you look at that line, I'm not even sure what colour it is because I'm colourblind, but that green, Jack?
The diagonal?
No, the bottom one.
Oh, yeah, green.
The horizontal one.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the positive predictive value. That's the percentage of times you said this, but people you thought were going to be victims. As you can see, there's hardly any increase in your ability to identify victims as the number of yes answers to questions increases. If you look at the AUC, I told you that 0.5 was close to, it was a guess. 0.544 is pretty close to a guess. So the reason you've got a high negative predictive value is simply because most people were judged not to be at serious risk and most people weren't at serious risk. So the short story is that it's not a terribly reliable predictor of intimate partner violence. It doesn't increase much with the number of yes answers. 70% of those who experience repeat victimisation had been classified as not at serious risk. 30% of those who are classified as not at serious risk were in fact re-victimised. So the AUC value, as I said, is not doing much better than chance. So the problem here is that you've got large numbers of people who are at serious risk who are not being referred, and large numbers of people who are at serious risk who are not being referred. So the obvious question is, well, what does predict intimate partner violence, repeat violence? So we undertook this study to try and get a better understanding of that. So the data source is the 2016 ABS Personal Safety Survey. It's a large representative sample survey across the country as a whole. The special thing about this survey compared with the annual victimisation survey that Karen was talking about is that they go to special efforts to ensure that when they interview women who are victims of various kinds of crime, when they get to the assault, they make special efforts to ensure that they are not asked in the presence of any male. Followed from the Canadian Survey of Violence Against Women. So there were 336 individuals who reported experiencing intimate partner violence in the 12 months prior to participating in the survey, and of those, 43% experienced repeat victimisation involving assault. So the data items we looked at were as many as we could get from the survey. I'll just let you scan over them as I go through. But I'm coming to the most important part about this survey. So in addition to all these factors which previous studies have shown to be significant correlates of victimisation, we also had one which, to the eternal credit of the ABS, they included, and that is emotional abuse. So the ABS has a wonderful list of factors which define as emotional abuse. A yes to any of these constitutes emotional abuse, and so we're very lucky to be able to include that. If you're not aware of this, Canadian research and research from a number of other countries have found emotional abuse is a very good predictor of physical domestic violence. So there are the results. Just looking down the odds ratios, or don't worry about those that are not significant, but if you look, for example, at social, these are just the only factors that were significant. So level of economic disadvantage, you can see that the odds, if you're in the most disadvantaged quartile of the population, the odds of you being a victim, a repeat victim of domestic intimate partner violence were 10, which is very big. The other quintiles were not significantly different from the lowest quintile. Remoteness is an issue. If you live in an inter-regional area, you're significantly more at risk than if you live in either the outer regional, remote or very remote areas, or I should say the inner city. I don't know why inter-regional is like that. That's a question for further research. You're much more at risk if you have a disability. You're much more at risk if your highest educational attainment is year 10 or below. And out of that emotional abuse, the single item that was the best predictor of being a repeat victim was whether the partner has control or tries to exercise control over contacts with family, friends or community. So this is a wonderful, the credit for this belongs to one of the researchers in the Bureau, Sarah Rahman. This is her DV heat map. Basically, here goes my colour blindness again, I think it's red.
Yeah.
Okay, the more red it is, the higher the risk. So if you look across, you can see the general pattern is that if you're in the lowest or the highest disadvantaged quintile, you're much more at risk. And you might notice too, if the answer is you're in a regional, you can see the risk extends up to the least disadvantaged quintile. Likewise, major cities, even in major cities, if you're answering yes to low education and yes to a disability, you're at risk. So you get some picture here, or diagraphic picture, of the way in which risk is spread across these various factors. We haven't developed an instrument, a new instrument for the DV-SAT. We would like to do that, but it's a job that really needs to be done in partnership with those who are actually delivering the services to victims of domestic violence, and we would like to be involved in that redesign. So, that's it about DV offenders, but of course one big question coming out of all of this treatment that doesn't show substantial effects is, are they specialists? Are they like other offenders or completely different? So we thought we'd have a look at that question. So the three questions we're interested in is, to what extent do DV offenders actually specialise in DV offending? What are the main types of non-DV offending that they commit? And lastly, how similar are offenders who only commit domestic violence assaults to offenders who only commit non-domestic violence assaults? Are they completely different groups, or are they basically fairly similar in terms of their criminal justice factors, but most importantly, in terms of the factors that would influence the selection of treatment? So I'll just go through that. So we had 100,668 persons convicted of New South Wales of a DV offence between 2008 and 2017. And so we were able to answer questions 1 and 2 just with that. To answer question 3, we compared two groups of people. Group 1 were those convicted of a DV assault in 2017, all of whose current offences and prior assault offences were DV related. And the second group were people who'd been convicted of a non-DV assault in 2017, and all their current, concurrent and prior offences, assault offences were non-DV related. So, the answer to the first two questions is easy. We had 100,668 DV offenders. Between them, they managed to generate 622,065 known offences. Of those, 236,000 of them were DV offences, but many more of them were non-DV offences, 385,741. So number one, they're enormously criminally productive. Number two, they're generating far more non-DV offences than they are DV offences. And this is interesting because I think most people's starting assumption would be they're mainly specialising in DV. Okay, so what do they do? So if you look down the left-hand column there, you'll see all the different things they can do. If you look down the column labelled N, you'll see the number of offences they did. And if you look down the middle column, don't worry about the far right one. If you look down the middle column, you see the number of offences. So just go, for example, to acts intended to cause injury. No big surprise there. You had 30,965 offenders who between them generated 62,726 acts intended to cause injury. That's what you'd expect. But go up a little bit to, for example, break and enter. 7,000 of the domestic violence offenders managed to generate 14,366 break and enters. And you'll find as you go through that you can do the comparisons yourself. But the general point that comes out of this table is that they are committing all sorts of offences. They're not restricting themselves even to violent offences. They're involved in burglary, they're involved in fraud, they're involved in robbery, public order offences. You can count on doing any of this. So the question is, how different are they in terms of people who just do DV assault? So what we've got here is we've taken the various demographic and criminal justice factors like age, gender, their number of prior offences, concurrent offences and so on, and we've tried as best we could to classify them as being either a DV assaulter or a non-DV assaulter, and we didn't do very well. So for example, we correctly classified 34%, 35% of the DV assaulters as DV assaulters, but we were wrong 65% of the time. We thought 65% of them were actually, of the people we classified as a DV assaulter, 65% of them turned out to be non-DV assaulters. Remember, there's a complete separation between these groups. Likewise, when trying to classify the non-DV assaulters, well, we were wrong 62% of the time. So again, you get evidence that you're not really dealing with hugely different offenders. Now, this point becomes even more apparent when you look at the LSIR. How many of you would be familiar with the LSIR? For those of you who are not familiar with, this is the primary instrument that corrective services use to identify the criminogenic needs that are driving offending. So it's partly involved in assessing risk, but its primary purpose is to identify the criminogenic factors, drug use, homelessness, hanging out with delinquent or criminal peers, etc. It's the primary diagnostic tool for working out what program to assign someone. So we tried to use the LSIR to see if we could separate people who only do DV assault from people who only do non-DV assault. And you can see, looking at the numbers straight away, we didn't do very well. It's a very poor basis on which to separate them. So what's the take-home message from this? Well, number one, most DV offenders, or at least those who wash up on the shores of the criminal justice system, are generalists rather than specialists. Only about a third of them turned out to be DV-only offenders. 2/3 were doing lots of other stuff as well. There's little difference in criminogenic terms between them. So it's time to come to the last program. Is everybody ready for the last one? I'm sorry this has been a long story, but I hope it's a story and not a piece of patchwork quilt for you. So this is the Violent Offender Treatment Program. The Violent Offender Treatment Program is run in New South Wales by Corrective Services. Obviously, it's there to reduce violent reoffending. The target group are medium high-risk violent offenders who are serving a minimum non-parole period of 2 years and who have at least 12 months remaining on their sentence. And the treatment, notice the difference between the intensity of treatment with this group and the DV equips treatment. So these people get 9 to 12 months weekly CBT in a therapeutic community setting. They are, however, all in prison, so they can't run away while they're getting treatment, and if you want to get parole, you've got to complete this, and that'll turn out to be an important point. So the evaluation design compared program starters with non-starters, but we also compared program completers with people who started but didn't complete. Now, many of you will know that this is an absolute anathema. You shouldn't normally compare completers to non-completers, but I'm here to tell you nearly everybody completed, and when we looked for differences between the completers and non-completers, we found almost no difference between them. So we thought we could get away with doing both sets of analyses. There are outcomes: reoffending with any offence, reoffending with any offence or return to custody, reoffending with a violent offence or reoffending with a violent offence or return to custody. There are our controls. For the statisticians, I can assure you that we did all the things you would normally do to check for omitted variable bias. Turned out we didn't need to worry about that. And here are the results. Now, a negative sign, again, is good news. and the star tells you that the result's significant. So when we compared the starting VOTP with those who didn't start, we got a significant reduction, 9% reduction in general reoffending, and we got a 7% reduction in general reoffending or returning to custody. We didn't get a significant reduction for the violent, but it was heading in the right direction. And it's important to bear in mind that, you know, you don't get, if you're not familiar with the rehabilitation literature, you don't normally get spectacular effects even outside the DV context. A typical reduction would be 9 or 10% reduction. So you're getting good results there. If you look at the completing VOTP versus not completing VOTP, once again, you're getting significant effects, and they're all in the right direction. I mean, all the results are in the right direction, which is hugely encouraging. So, summary, VOTP does appear to reduce reoffending. The lack of an effect on violence may be a sample size problem because reoffending is actually quite rare. So I just want to finish with one slide, and it's the most important of all the slides I'm going to show you, which is where do we go from here? Well, the first thing I'd suggest, and it's only a suggestion, I'm not a clinical psychologist, is that it would be nice to try and boost the treatment in DV equips to see whether you're getting the sorts of results you get from the VOTP. Corrective Services is actually doing that. They've got a program called the PGI, and the aim here is to improve the treatment integrity to make sure that it conforms to the R&R process. So I think that's a good move. The second thing is that it would be really, really interesting to compare the support that DV CAS people give with the support provided under the Safer Pathway. I'm not suggesting here that people involved in Safer Pathway were anything less than enthusiastic and committed, but it may be that in practice the levels of support provided under these two regimes were fairly similar. The next thing I think would be really interesting, you remember that LAC 4 or LAC Group 4, something was going right with them. It would be really interesting to go and talk to the people in that pair of LACs about what they were doing and compare that with the LACs where things weren't going as well. And I think that would be a really nice piece of research to do. Obviously, we need to revise the DV-SAT in accord with evidence on risk. I think that's really important. I suspect we might need to devise programs that address a wider range of criminogenic risk factors, not just those that we think are tied to domestic violence. It would be really interesting to try VOTP on domestic violence itself. That's probably impractical, but it would be really interesting to see how it goes specifically for those who commit domestic violence. It would be good to repeat all of this with a much larger sample size, and that's the end of the story. And now you can ask all the questions you like, and thanks for being patient. You want to come up, Craig?